on the distant planet of Altharis, an event was taking place that would change the course of galactic history. It was the Grand Galactic Summit, a meeting where representatives from multiple planets, star systems, and civilizations came together to discuss peace, trade, and the future of the galaxy. The summit was held once every 10 years and was an opportunity for various alien races to make alliances and forge relationships. This time, however, there was an added layer of tension. The humans, relatively new players on the galactic stage, had sent their best diplomat, Jacob Wren, a man known not for his charm or charisma, but for his quiet strength and tactical genius. He was a human whose presence alone often spoke louder than his words. The Althurians, an ancient and advanced species, were hosting the summit. Their capital was a shining city in the clouds, built on a giant floating island with towering spires and bridges that stretched across the sky. Althurians were known for their intellect and grace. Their society was built on the pursuit of knowledge, diplomacy, and culture. Princess Lyra, the 19-year-old heir to the throne, had been chosen to represent her people. Although young, she was already one of the brightest minds in Althurian politics, with a reputation for being wise beyond her years. Her father, King Ulrich, was one of the most respected leaders in the galaxy, and Lyra had been groomed to continue his legacy. However, despite her intellect and grace, Lyra was also known for her sharp tongue and quick temper. Her confidence sometimes bordered on arrogance, especially when dealing with species she considered less sophisticated than her own. The humans were at the top of her list. To her, they were primitive, their technology raw, their society chaotic. She had been briefed on their history, how they had fought wars among themselves, how their nations had risen and fallen, and how their technological advances had been made not through unity, but through survival against odds. It was a history she found both fascinating and distasteful. The moment Jacob Wren entered the Grand Hall, Lyra couldn't help but study him. He was different from the other humans she had met. Most humans were eager, almost desperate to prove themselves on the galactic stage. But not Jacob. He was quiet, observing everything with a kind of calm detachment. His appearance was plain compared to the highly polished diplomats from other races. He wore a simple black suit, his face lined with age and experience, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. Lyra noticed the way he carried himself, a stillness that contrasted with the movement of the others. It was as if he didn't need to be noticed to be powerful. She couldn't understand him. He was a man who had no desire to impress anyone, who didn't seem to care about what others thought of him. And for some reason, that made her want to challenge him. She saw it as a weakness, a failure to live up to the expectations of the galaxy's elites. She was determined to see through this facade, to make him react, to make him show the depth of his character. It all began during a discussion about trade and technology. The delegates were sitting at a long, oval table, and the conversation was progressing smoothly. Each representative was explaining their species, unique contributions to galactic society. When it came time for the humans to speak, Jacob Wren stood up. His voice was low and measured as he explained the human perspective on trade and technology. It was practical, direct, and to the point. He spoke of humanity's innovations, not as grand gestures, but as solutions to problems they had faced through war, poverty, and isolation. Princess Lyra listened closely, her expression cool, but in her mind, she couldn't help but scoff. She had heard similar speeches before, and each time she had dismissed them as the ramblings of a race too consumed with their own survival to understand the broader picture. But as Jacob continued, something about his tone began to irritate her. It wasn't his words, it was the way he spoke, the way he seemed so sure of himself without offering any evidence of greatness. He made it seem so simple, as if humanity's place in the galaxy was just another fact of life. Lyra leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "It sounds like your people simply survive," she said, her voice sharp. You build your technology only to fight wars and protect yourselves from the chaos you've created. It's a never-ending cycle. How is that worthy of praise? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, and even Jacob paused. Lyra's words hung in the air like an accusation. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She was simply speaking her mind as she had always done. But the way she said it, the way she framed it, was meant to challenge the very foundation of human existence. To her, it was an easy attack, an insult disguised as a question. Jacob's gaze shifted from her face to the floor, and for a brief moment it seemed as if he was considering a response. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again. Instead of rising to the challenge, he simply turned around and walked out of the room. Lyra watched him leave, bewildered. The other delegates were just as stunned. No one had ever walked away from a diplomatic conversation like that, especially not in the middle of a summit. It was an unspoken rule of galactic diplomacy that you never left the table without engaging. You never showed disrespect, even when you felt it was deserved. As Jacob walked out of the room, Lyra sat there, her mouth slightly open, unsure of what had just happened. She had expected him to argue, to defend his people with words, or perhaps to call her out for her arrogance. But he didn't. He simply left. It was as if he didn't need to prove anything to her or anyone else. In that moment, Lyra felt a shift. She had expected a reaction, but instead, she had been met with silence. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something important, something she couldn't quite understand. Her mind raced as she considered the implications of his actions. Why had he left? Was it because he had no response, or was it because he had nothing to prove? The summit continued, but Lyra's thoughts were elsewhere. She tried to focus on the discussions around her, but her mind kept returning to Jacob Wren. What kind of man could walk away from a confrontation without uttering a word? What kind of species could produce someone like him? That evening, Lyra found herself alone in her quarters, staring out at the floating city below. The sun had just set, casting an orange glow across the sky. The streets below were filled with the hum of alien life, the air thick with the scent of exotic flowers and spices. But for all the beauty around her, Lyra felt unsettled. She couldn't get Jacob's face out of her mind. She was used to being the one in control of any situation, the one who dictated the course of events. But with him, she had felt powerless. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that his silence had affected her in ways she couldn't explain. He had said nothing, yet his actions had spoken volumes. It was as though he had broken an unspoken rule of engagement. In his refusal to argue, he had won the battle without ever raising his voice. It was at that moment that Lyra knew she would have to learn more about him. She had underestimated him, and she couldn't afford to do that again. She stood up and walked to the communication panel, sending a message to her aides. It was time to investigate humanity. Not just their technology, not just their history, but the very essence of their culture. She needed to understand Jacob Wren, and through him, she needed to understand the humans. But as she sent the message, a small part of her knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, one where words might not be enough, and where the true nature of humanity would be revealed. The following days of the summit passed in a blur for Princess Lyra. The gala events, the talks on trade, the meetings with representatives from different species, all felt distant to her now. Her thoughts were consumed by Jacob Wren. The human diplomat who had walked away without a word had left an impression that Lyra couldn't shake. His silence, so powerful, spoke more than any argument or defense could have, and it made her uneasy. Lyra had grown up in a world where words were the currency of power. The Arthurians valued intelligence, diplomacy, and the ability to persuade others with logic and grace. But Jacob Wren didn't seem to care for any of that. He had shown her the power of simply walking away, of refusing to engage when provoked. And in doing so, he had made her feel small, like she wasn't worthy of his time or energy. Her curiosity grew, and she found herself thinking about the human race more often than she would have liked to admit. She had always thought of humanity as chaotic, disorganized, and primitive, nothing more than a species struggling to survive. But what if she had been wrong? What if there was more to them than she realized? Lyra spent the next few days observing Jacob from a distance. She attended the sessions where he spoke, listening to his calm voice and simple, no-nonsense explanations about human society, technology, and culture. It was clear that he wasn't interested in impressing anyone. He didn't embellish his words or seek praise. Instead, he focused on the practicalities of human life, on their survival, their resilience, and their ability to adapt to the most difficult circumstances. What fascinated Lyra the most was how Jacob spoke about humanity's history. He didn't boast about their achievements, nor did he apologize for their mistakes. He simply told the truth, about wars, about suffering, about the moments that had shaped them into who they were today. There was no pretense, no pride, just honesty, and that more than anything intrigued her. One evening, after a long day of discussions, Lyra found herself walking through the grand corridors of the summit's venue, deep in thought. She had just attended a meeting where Jacob had once again stood up, not to argue, but to quietly point out a flaw in the plan that was being discussed. His comment was brief and direct, yet it had shifted the entire direction of the conversation. And for some reason, that had stuck with her. As she walked through the empty hallway, lost in her thoughts, she accidentally bumped into one of the human delegates, a tall, thin woman named Alina. Alina was a part of Jacob's team and had been with him throughout the summit. Lyra had heard her speak a few times, but she had never really paid attention to her until now. "Oh, I'm sorry," Lyra said quickly, looking up at Alina. "It's no trouble, Princess," Alina replied with a smile. "I was just on my way to grab something to eat." "You must be exhausted after all these long hours." Lyra nodded, but then something inside her made her ask, "Can I ask you something, Alina?" "Of course," Alina said, looking at Lyra with curiosity. "I've been thinking a lot about Jacob," Lyra began, unsure of how to word her thoughts. "I don't understand him. He doesn't seem to care about the formalities, the diplomacy. He doesn't even try to prove himself to anyone. Why is that?" Alina smiled softly, a knowing look in her eyes. "That's just how Jacob is. He's not here to win anyone over or to impress anyone. He's here to get the job done. He's always been that way." Lyra frowned, trying to wrap her mind around this. "But doesn't he care what others think of him? Doesn't he care about the outcome of these negotiations?" "Not in the way you think," Alina said, her voice calm and measured. "Jacob's job isn't to get people to like him. It's to make sure things work. He cares about results, about making sure that when the talks are over, people can walk away knowing that the agreements made are solid, fair, and sustainable. He doesn't care about personal glory or status. He cares about making things right, even if it's not the most popular thing to do." Lyra listened intently. It was a way of thinking that was completely foreign to her. She had been taught her whole life that the key to power was in diplomacy, in making others see things your way. But Jacob's approach was different. He didn't manipulate or twist words to suit his needs. He simply spoke the truth and let the results speak for themselves. "Does he always act like this?" Lyra asked. "Always," Alina replied. "He's been like this ever since I met him. He's not afraid to walk away from a situation if it doesn't make sense to him. It's his way of showing respect, not only to others but to himself." Lyra's mind was racing. She had never considered the idea that someone could have such unwavering self-respect. To her, it seemed like weakness, turning away from conflict instead of facing it head-on. But as she thought about it more, she realized that perhaps it wasn't weakness at all. Maybe it was strength. The strength to know when to speak and when to be silent. The strength to walk away when others would have fought. The more Lyra thought about Jacob, the more she realized that there was so much she didn't understand. There was something about his simplicity, his quiet confidence, that made him seem more powerful than anyone she had met before. And she couldn't deny it. She wanted to learn more about him. She wanted to understand the human race through his eyes, to see what made them tick, to learn what drove them to survive and thrive in a galaxy full of dangers. Later that night, after the summit's events had ended, Lyra found herself in her private quarters, staring out at the city below. The lights of Altharis sparkled in the distance, and the stars above seemed to stretch on forever. She felt small, insignificant, like one tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a deep sense of longing. She wanted to connect with Jacob, to understand him. But more than that, she wanted to connect with humanity. She wanted to know what made them tick, what gave them the drive to push forward despite all the obstacles in their way. The next day, during a break in the summit's schedule, Lyra took a bold step. She approached Jacob, who was sitting alone in the garden, gazing out at the vast landscape. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then she gathered her courage and walked over to him. Jacob didn't look up when she approached, but his voice was calm as always. "Princess Lyra," he said, acknowledging her presence. "I've been thinking a lot about you," Lyra said, sitting down beside him. Jacob raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He simply waited for her to continue. "I don't understand why you walked away the other day," Lyra admitted. "Why did you do that?" Jacob's eyes finally met hers. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet understanding. Sometimes the best response is no response at all. Words don't always solve problems. Sometimes silence does. Lyra stared at him, trying to understand his words. He wasn't trying to explain himself, but in that one sentence he had given her more than she had expected. "But don't you care about the outcome? Don't you want to win these negotiations?" "I don't care about winning," Jacob said, his voice steady. "I care about doing what's right. If that means walking away, then I'll walk away. It's not about personal victory. It's about what's best for everyone." Lyra felt a wave of realization wash over her. She had been so focused on proving herself, on making others see her as powerful and capable, that she had lost sight of the bigger picture. She had been playing the game of diplomacy without truly understanding what it meant to be a leader. For the first time, she felt like she was starting to see humanity, not through the lens of superiority, but through the eyes of someone who had nothing to prove. Jacob Wren wasn't just a diplomat. He was a reflection of humanity's quiet strength. And in that moment, Lyra understood something important. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to simply be true to yourself, without needing to prove anything to anyone. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of her journey into understanding the humans, and perhaps herself. The days after that conversation were quieter, but Lyra couldn't shake the thoughts that kept creeping into her mind. She had always prided herself on her ability to understand others, to read them like an open book. But Jacob Wren had proven her wrong. He was an enigma. Even after the summit's discussions, his silence, his simple yet profound responses, lingered in her thoughts. She had thought he was just another human, another cog in the machine of diplomacy. But now she realized there was so much more to him, and to the humans in general. Over the next few days, Lyra observed Jacob more closely, trying to understand his every move. She saw how he interacted with others, not just during the official meetings but in the quieter moments as well. He didn't speak much unless he had something important to say. He didn't seek attention or validation. Instead, he listened. He watched. And when it was necessary, he acted, with calm precision and an unshakable sense of purpose. The summit continued with more talks, more debates, and more discussions about the future of the galaxy. But something had changed. Lyra found herself questioning everything she had known about diplomacy. She had been taught to manipulate words, to craft arguments that would sway the opinions of others. But Jacob's approach was different. He didn't manipulate. He didn't twist the truth to suit his needs. He simply spoke plainly, and in doing so, he earned the respect of everyone around him. Lyra's growing respect for him was mixed with a strange feeling she couldn't quite define. It wasn't admiration, not in the way one might admire a great leader or a famous general. It was something deeper. She found herself drawn to his quiet strength, the way he seemed unbothered by the opinions of others, as though the only thing that mattered to him was doing what was right, even if it wasn't popular. He didn't need the approval of others. He was his own man. One afternoon, as the summit entered its final stages, Lyra found herself walking through the grand gardens of the venue, lost in her thoughts. She had spent the entire morning listening to the other delegates speak, and yet her mind kept drifting back to Jacob. What made him so different from everyone else? Why was it that she felt like she had just begun to scratch the surface of understanding him? As she walked through the lush, vibrant gardens, she spotted Jacob standing alone by a fountain, his back to her. For a moment, she hesitated. Should she approach him again? Would he even want to talk to her after everything that had happened? She knew she had been rude to him, dismissive of his humanity, but something inside her pushed her forward. She had to know more. "Jacob," she said, her voice soft but steady. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable as always. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, only that calm, almost detached gaze that had become so familiar to her. "Princess Lyra," he said, acknowledging her presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lyra found herself at a loss for words. She had wanted to ask him questions, to understand why he was the way he was, but now that she was standing in front of him, she felt unsure of how to proceed. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," she said, finally breaking the silence. "About why you walked away that day, and I think I understand now. You weren't just ignoring me. You were showing me something, weren't you?" Jacob nodded slowly, his expression softening just slightly. "I wasn't trying to ignore you. I simply didn't have anything more to say." "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." Lyra frowned, her brow furrowing. "But silence doesn't solve anything. Words are how we communicate, how we connect with others. How can you expect anything to change if you don't speak up?" "Words are important," Jacob said, his voice steady. "But sometimes the most important thing is knowing when to speak and when to be silent. When you speak all the time, people stop listening. But when you choose your words carefully, when you only speak when it matters, your words have more weight. Your actions, too, have more weight when you don't waste them on things that don't matter." Lyra absorbed his words, the truth of them sinking in slowly. She had always believed that the more she spoke, the more power she would have. But Jacob's approach was different. His power came from his restraint. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had no need for validation or approval. He had earned respect, not through words or displays of strength, but through quiet actions and unshakable conviction. "Do you ever feel like you need to prove yourself?" Lyra asked, her voice quieter now. Jacob's gaze met hers, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something, perhaps a trace of emotion, something deeper. "Every day," he said simply, "but I don't need to prove myself to others. I only need to prove to myself that I'm doing what's right." Lyra felt a shift inside her. She had been so focused on impressing others, on proving her worth to those around her. But Jacob was different. He didn't seek to impress anyone. He simply did what he believed was right, and that was enough for him. For the first time, Lyra realized that true power didn't come from forcing others to see things your way. It came from knowing who you were and standing firm in your beliefs, regardless of what others thought. Jacob's strength wasn't in his words, but in his ability to remain true to himself, no matter the situation. The conversation that day changed something in Lyra. She found herself reflecting on her own actions, on how she had treated others in the past. She realized that she had often used her words to manipulate, to shape situations to her advantage. But Jacob's words made her see that true leadership wasn't about bending others to your will. It was about inspiring them through your actions, your integrity, and your ability to stand firm in your convictions. As the summit came to an end, the delegates prepared to leave. Lyra found herself standing once again beside Jacob, though this time the silence between them felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable or awkward, but rather peaceful. They didn't need to speak to understand each other. They had both learned something valuable during their time together. "Well, I suppose this is it," Lyra said, looking out at the city below. "It's been eye-opening." Jacob nodded. "I think we've both learned a lot." Lyra turned to him, her eyes meeting his with newfound respect. "I may not agree with everything you believe, Jacob, but I do respect you. You've shown me that there's more than one way to lead, more than one way to make a difference." Jacob gave a small smile, the first genuine one Lyra had seen from him. "I appreciate that, Princess. And maybe one day, you'll see that humanity's strength isn't just in our words, but in our ability to endure, to adapt, and to rise above whatever challenges come our way." As the two of them stood there, side by side, Lyra realized that the future was not as clear-cut as she had once thought. She had always believed that her way of thinking, her way of leading, was the right one. But now she saw that there were other paths to follow, other ways to navigate the complexities of the universe. And perhaps, just perhaps, humanity had something to teach her after all. Jacob's silence, once something she had viewed as a weakness, had become a powerful lesson in restraint and self-respect. It had shown her that sometimes, the most important thing you could do was to simply stand firm in your beliefs, to let your actions speak louder than words. And in doing so, you could inspire others, not through force but through quiet strength. As the summit came to a close, Lyra felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She had learned something valuable, not just about Jacob, but about herself. She had learned that there was more to leadership than simply commanding respect. There was also the power of silence, of choosing when to speak and when to listen. And for the first time, Lyra felt ready to embrace that lesson, to apply it in her own life, and to move forward with a new understanding of what it meant to lead. The stars above shone brightly, and for a moment, Lyra felt as though the entire galaxy was within her reach. The future was uncertain, but she now knew that the strength of humanity and the power of their silence would be a guiding force in the journey ahead.